We should put in place effective security tools and layers prior to any breach event. Really, I'm going to say it a couple times here today, if we don't have the right things in place, the right logging, the right security systems, not only can we not defend from those attacks, but we can't detect them either. And then we have a harder time reacting to them if we don't protect them timely enough. So that's some ways to teach the employees about that. Like it says there at the last one, primary way to have information available for your investigation afterwards is to have the right layers in place beforehand. So really a lot of this has to do with layered security or defense in depth. This is something that SANS organization has been espousing for decades, and it's something I've been practicing for decades myself. It's not always easily done, but it's critical. So the things in your layers would be things like firewalls, intrusion prevention systems or IPS, endpoint security, I'll talk a little bit more about that, 24/7 monitoring so that when a bad event happens, we have some indication of what it was and how serious we need to, how quickly we need to react to it. I might go ahead and say layered security there. In the big picture, what I'm trying to describe, I often describe it to management teams as kind of a jawbreaker compared to an M&M. Is there just one little layer that we crack through that, we get inside and get all the goodies like an M&M? Or do we have layer after layer after layer, and someone should not get far into our network before we've got indications that we need to go check into what that event was. Real-time alerts should be sent to someone at your organization or your third party, if you're using a third party to help manage your technology, or both really, because people take vacations, etc., have sick days. So real-time alerts when an event happens, but then also monitoring so that if you're not getting real-time alerts, that there's some sort of a breach or a firewall event or a virus or malware, at least if we're getting those periodic reports saying that, for example, antivirus is still in place, it's still updating itself, it's still scanning itself, we're just not having any new events we have to act on. But so many times I do an IT audit, and I unfortunately the first one to tell them, this is been failing or out of play for months or something. It should be that management knows that every day, or every week, every month. So also plan and know who's responsible to receive and use those alerts that you're going to be getting from those monitoring and alert systems. Vulnerability management program is extremely important. That's stuff I deal with all the time. And like John said, that typically those vulnerabilities are going to be what's getting hacked, or it's the second step in a breach of a network. So it should be continuous, and then once vulnerabilities are identified, we should be mitigating them or taking steps to remove them. So as part of the vulnerability management program, we need to know everything on the network. We need to know what you already know is on the network as of today and yesterday, but if something new plugs into the network, we need to have awareness of that because it's either an authorized device or non-authorized device. And if we don't know what's on our network, we can't take steps to properly secure them, patch them, update them, whatever kind of maintenance they need to be a safe asset. Part of vulnerability management is vulnerability assessment testing, or VA testing. When I do these, I'm a firm believer that you need to do that in an authenticated manner. And so with the VA test, you can either have the tool actually log into some of the systems, typically the Windows systems, but you can also do it on Cisco devices and things like that. But if we don't do it with authentication, or another word for that is credentialed, then it's sort of like an external pen test from the internet, just to see if you can break into that PC or that server. You're inside the network, but can you break into it? Much more important, in my opinion, are the vulnerabilities that come into play when the humans go out to the internet, getting files, surfing websites, running scripts on websites, getting email, etc. So the authenticated testing will tell you much more about the patching and the software inside of the user's workstation or terminal server or whatever it is we're testing. Advanced endpoint security, I talked a little bit about this, I alluded to it, but the antivirus no longer is effective against modern day attacks. It's nowadays you don't have to be a programmer or have even much tech expertise, but you can go out on the internet, have someone build you an attack, a piece of malware, antivirus, or you can get tools to build your own. So nowadays, if a true piece of malware or virus is used, they'll attack the one target and then throw that virus away. So antivirus software never knows the name of it, or the activity of it. And so the advanced endpoint protection is going to do, it's going to look more at the behavior of what's on the machine. One common brand that kind of started this idea was Carbon Black, but many antivirus traditional vendors are also building these next generation protections into their things. But sometimes we have to install it and then turn on that extra protection. But a simple example to try to explain what that's like is something like Carbon Black would say, okay, Bob has run Word or Excel or whatever it is 10,000 times on that workstation, but today for the first time ever, a process hopped out of Word and hopped into a command prompt and tried to do something that should never be expected. And so if we've got that layer in place and we've got those alerts on, within a couple minutes, the network administrator could know something's weird on Bob's workstation and threaten it. Reduce the number of users with admin access. Really, if a user who's got administrator access is the one who gets breached, falls for the clicking on the wrong thing, and it's really game over with inside the network. The attacker is going to have admin rights, and it may be much longer than 7 months before you know they're in it. Center for Internet Security Controls, I'm a big believer in. I'll talk about some of the control sets they've got that help secure the network. First one is the top 20 controls. This has been in use for decades. Computer geeks as myself are familiar with it. A lot of times it doesn't get talked about a lot though. And so just to prove how much of a value that is, if a company can employ just the first 5 of those 20 controls, as much as 85% of the known attacks in the world will not succeed against that organization. If you could employ all 20 of those controls, somewhere around 95% of the attacks are not going to be successful against your network. So even though you may have vulnerabilities remaining, attackers typically going to get frustrated and move on to the next person who's not employing a lot of those good controls. So along with the top 20 controls, CIS has a self-assessment tool. So if you're trying to implement those, that'll help you gauge where you are in that process. And then they've also got another set of controls for telework and small office network guide. So that's going to help people who work remotely, whether it's from their home or from a coffee shop, telework more safely. And the small office network security guide is especially helpful if you've maybe got a smaller IT department or not a lot of expertise in-house where you have to pay a lot for it. It's just almost a checklist of what to do inside your network to get good controls and get security, cybersecurity. Passwords, of course, very critical. Keep requiring strong password practices. They should be changed periodically. The length should be longer. For a long time, 6 or 8 characters was acceptable. With the power of cracking tools nowadays, 10 characters or longer really should be what we're doing. Improve backup procedures. That's the best security practice because a clean and a current backup is going to be your primary way to not pay ransom if you had a ransomware event in your network. So get some backups that are offline so that they can't be encrypted if that ransomware gets your network. And then also enable alerts and notifications. Kind of going back to that slide earlier, let's have some reporting that just tells us that the systems are working. So often backups don't work for a long time, and if we just put an email address in there, someone would have heard about it before I have to implement things. Monitoring managed service providers, or MSPs. A lot of the banks I work with use a third party to manage the firewall, to manage the network users, to do the patching, manage the servers, etc. And so they're reliant on that partner for all of that. But as of the last couple of years, nation states such as China and Russia have very much been focused on trying to get into these MSP networks because it's just a gold mine. If I can get a PC of someone who their only job is to go manage 20 other networks, really I've just infiltrated 20 networks by taking over one machine. And again, if it's not found for 7 months, that's a lot of actions. So that's very critical for you and your providers to know, admit that the attacks are there, and then for you to put in place procedures to oversee what they're doing for your network, how they get in, when they get in, who they get in, etc. So there's a technical alert there from Homeland Security that describes that. One example that was fascinating to me earlier, InfraGard, that's a combination of a relationship between companies, private companies, and Homeland Security, CIA, and FBI. But in February, they emphasized this where they were giving us something that kind of was knowledge at the time, but 2,000 machines on an MSP network, were taken over with ransomware. So again, if all 2,000 of those machines are going into 20 other networks, we've got 40,000 networks at hand for the attackers. So it's important to know that that is a problem. I'd also mention on that 2,000 machine breach, ConnectWise was the tool that the attackers got into. There's a vulnerability in that, and the patch had been available for a long time prior to the day they breach happened. Use multi-factor authentication for remote access. Anyone coming into your network, whether it's an employee or a third-party MSP like I talked about, anyone coming in, we should have multi-factor authentication if we can. It gives you a lot more confidence that it's an authorized person coming in, not unauthorized. So switching kind of from some straight tech topics to corporate account takeover, or CATO as we call it. A lot of other names have been put on in recent years, CATO, or a lot of times it focuses on the executives' account being taken over. But in working with banks, Iowa Division of Banking actually sent out a memo or guidance to all Iowa banks in 2011 saying that you must address corporate account takeover in your risk planning or your risk assessments, as well as in your incident response planning. If you know there's a CATO event, incident response is just far more effective if we have planned for it. So just billions and billions of dollars are being lost in CATO, and some of the examples John is going to go through are straight CATO events. Work with your financial institution to know and use the controls and security practices that they have. So working with them before those problems arise, again, is where your value is. If you are prepared for it, then if you have that bad event happening, the cleanup is far more effective and much more quicker. So work with your bank to know the controls and best practices that they have and they recommend, because one brand of banking product is not the same as another. So whatever they've got available and recommend are likely to be most effective if you have an event, CATO or some other kind of monetary fraud. And it's important to know that a lot of the best effective controls that we can put in place are done at your site, your workplace, not something the bank can do for you. For sure, they have many, many procedures that they've implemented over the last 8 or 9 years that's going to reduce the risk of corporate account takeover and fraudulent wires or ACHs. But really, a lot of it has to be done at your place so that your machine doesn't get breached, your user doesn't get phished. You don't have so many vulnerabilities that you're in the place where the weakness was first taken advantage of. And then train employees so that they know the common attacks that are happening. Phishing is phishing, but the different tactics used can be very effective at different times and they change. Use dual controls on wire transfers and ACH. So wire transfers and ACHs are how you move a lot of funds very quickly. If it's fraudulent, wire transfers and ACH is how you fraudulently move a lot of funds quickly. So use dual controls. Don't have one person's user login able to enter the wire transfer, approve it, and then release it. Have different people have those access rights, and then it's going to reduce what an attacker could do if they just get one person to log in. And then use extra validation steps whenever the transfer is going to a new recipient or to a new account number. Really, that's common amongst all the theft scenarios. It's not going to go to people that you regularly send money. It's not going to go to accounts that you regularly send money. So work with the bank or find out controls you can do. And if something's actually going to go out the door to a new recipient or a new account, have it stopped. Make sure that we're calling or talking to a person on a contact phone number that we know is good, because a lot of those methods are what goes wrong in fraudulent transfer. Last bit on CATO here, work with the bank to know incident response procedures that are available. So timing is critical. If we know that someone's sent out a wire on your bank accounts, we now need to wonder if they are also into your ACH or into your bill pay or whatever it might be. There are actually very effective ways to stop some of those things immediately, but sometimes they're not well known. Sometimes the bank doesn't know it well. But if we do that learning exercise up front, then if it happens, we're prepared to react to it effectively and quickly. Use multi-factor authentication on any higher risk funds transfer. It's kind of hard to consider almost any funds transfer not higher risk, so that's pretty well everything. If the bank can offer it, use multi-factor authentication. Use only secured or encrypted messaging delivery. So if you're sending emails to anyone outside the organization, typically inside the organization, all the emails should be encrypted by default. But if we're sending something to someone outside, if it's not an encrypted message, it's easily intercepted by someone who just has access to the right parts of the network. Um, Put in place reasonable dollar limits for all funds transfers. So if, for example, you know that you never send a wire transfer greater than 5,000, let's put a limit on there, an automatic limit of $7,500. And so the days that we go over $7,500, we're just going to have to talk and verify it real quick before it goes out. But all the other days, we're going to be protected from any unauthorized transfers, at least going over, over 5,000. Why allow a $100,000 transfer if you can never perform one for business reasons? Monitor all funds transfer activities. So just knowing what the activity is will help you more quickly identify any unauthorized transfers. And then inform the bank of any normal or expected transfer schedules and amounts. So if someone's trying to send an ACH payroll file on the day that you don't do your payroll, the banks would be glad to stop at that point and contact the right person at your entity and say, is this legitimate? Is this a bonus pay run, or why would it be going out today, or why is it much larger than usual? So John's going to go through some
Thanks, Bob. And so kind of putting some of that stuff together, I'm an attorney, and so and a litigator at that. And so everything that I learn about, and I see the world through the lens of litigation. And so what's interesting to me is how are these cybersecurity issues cropping up in lawsuits? And one of the common types of cases that we've seen is lawsuits between organizations and their insurance companies after a loss has occurred. And it's good that Bob was just talking about corporate account takeover, because those are very often the scenarios that are getting litigated between organizations and their insurance companies. So PSG versus Ironshore is a good example of this. PSG is a wealth management company. They manage the assets of high net worth individuals. They have access to bank accounts, powers of attorney for those individuals. 9:10 a.m. On a weekday, the controller at the organization receives an email purportedly from the managing director of the organization saying, hey, somebody's going to be calling you to do a wire transfer. We need to get the wire transfer out today. By the way, I'm out of the office. About an hour later, indeed, somebody does call, claiming to be a lawyer, and says, hey, I'm the lawyer you heard about in that email from your boss. I'm going to be emailing you a set of wire instructions. We need to get this wire out today. Controller says, yep, sure, no problem. The lawyer had claimed that the wire transfer was authorized. Well, the lawyer, in fact, emails wire instructions to the controller. Controller says, great, no problem, emails it to the bank. A lot of cases I've dealt with, that might have been the end of it. The bank might have executed the wire transfer. But in this case, the bank didn't. The bank said, hold on, we've got a process in place for verifying any wire transfer that we want to send out before we actually do it. Told the controller, you've got to log into the bank's online portal, set up the transaction there. There's some security features to ensure that this is a legitimate transaction, that it's coming from you. And so the controller did. Controller logs in, sets up the wire, sends it. Bank's fraud department flags it again, says, hold on, this is outside the normal pattern of activity for this organization. We don't think you want to be sending this out. Will you please call and verify that you actually want to send this wire out? So the controller calls up the quote-unquote lawyer and says, do you want the wire? The lawyer says, well, absolutely, I want the wire. Please go ahead and send that out today. The controller calls back to the bank and says, yep, here we go, ready to send it out. Bank releases $1.7 million. You can imagine the conversation in the office the next day between the controller and the managing director. Hey, glad you got that wire out. What wire? What are you talking about? Call up the bank, realize the money's gone. Because in fact, it went overseas to a fraudster account, and then the money disappeared from that account. So who's responsible for this? In a circumstance where you've got an unauthorized transaction from the standpoint of the organization. Well, everyone in this room is familiar with Regulation E, even if you don't know it. Regulation E is the federal banking law that says if you lose your debit card at a restaurant and somebody picks it up, swipes it, and charges something to it, your bank reimburses you. That regulation, that federal law, only applies to consumer transactions. When we're dealing with a business transaction, we've got a whole different regulatory framework. And under that regulatory framework, that set of rules that establish liability, banks start out being responsible to customers for unauthorized transactions from their accounts. However, banks can shift that liability to depositors if
the bank and the depositor have agreed on a commercially reasonable security procedure that they use to verify wire transfers before they actually go out. And so if we think back to the PSG case, that's why the bank shoved the controller toward the online portal system, because that way the bank knows if that transaction comes in and it's followed all the procedures that were put in place for verifying those transactions, that it's a legitimate transaction. And once the bank has satisfied itself that it's a legitimate transaction, the bank is no longer liable for that transaction to go out. So even though this transaction was unauthorized from the standpoint of PSG, from the standpoint of the bank, everything was valid and authentic. And so the bank in PSG versus Ironshore is not liable to the organization, even though the organization may have been defrauded. Now, I've dealt with enough situations where people have been defrauded in this way to know that the expectation, at least initially, is, well, the bank is going to come and reimburse me because it was fraud, and my bank always reimburses me for fraud. But that's simply not the case. And so organizations need to depend upon themselves to make sure that these kinds of situations actually don't occur. So if we are confronted with a situation like PSG was, where an organization realizes, oh no, I sent out a wire transfer or some other funds transfer when I shouldn't have, what do we do next? Well, the two things that I would recommend doing initially would be to report the transaction to the FBI. The FBI's reporting system on IC3.gov does have some ability to stop wire transfers in certain circumstances. I would also contact the bank, though, like Bob said, because the bank may have the ability to more quickly try to claw the wire back or stop it at least where it is, hopefully domestically, before the money goes abroad. And in those circumstances, we might be able to recover the money. If we aren't able to recover the money, then you're going to be talking to a lawyer, because your options are going to be to potentially examine whether the bank did anything wrong in the transaction, and in that case you may be able to pursue the bank for recovery of those funds. You probably also want to talk to a forensic investigator, because in the PSG case we don't really know, at least from what we're aware of, whether or not there was any unauthorized access to the email system. We know there were some fraudulent emails that were coming into the organization, but we don't know if that's because the fraudsters were simply spoofing those emails or if they had access to PSG's internal system. And then you're probably talking to your insurance company, as PSG did in this case. Unfortunately, what PSG learned was that they didn't have the right kind of insurance coverage, even though they thought they had quote-unquote cyber insurance. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, because cyber insurance is often not what it's marketed as, which is coverage for everything. So, Bob, I don't know if you want to cover real quickly a couple of things. How do we know we've been breached? Addressing the situation in PSG, how do we know if the fraudsters actually had access to the email system?
Sure, and for the sake of today's discussion, I didn't try and go into a deep technical talk about what really can be done. There's a lot that can be done, but it really comes back to that first statement there. Security systems and event monitoring in place before the event happened are what's going to determine how much or how little forensic can be done afterwards. So I really can't emphasize that enough. To come in and ask for what you have in place for security software and devices, and then look for the best information out of that. Hopefully you've already got it under control, you're managing it, monitoring it. So I'm not trying to cop out there, but that really lays the groundwork of what's possible in the first place. If it's straight involving email, you can look at the headers. That will show where the message truly came from and where the message the path it took to get to the recipient, and therefore you can determine whether it was outside your network, outside of your users or not. There's some tricky tech exceptions to that, but really those pretty well been taken out of the market. But it is still possible. Sometimes I can push an email to someone from them. It's just resolved in minutes if they fix their mail. So, identify who knew the underlying transaction. So if it's something where one of the parties is someone you trust, if we think that a fraudster started it or started the discussion or got in the middle of the discussion, if we had only two parties who knew it, then we can almost be assured that it was sent unencrypted and the message was intercepted, or one of those parties' actual email is taken over, or phone mail is bugged, or whatever it might be. On one of the cases John's gonna describe here, it popped out at me, and who's the controller calling? So if we're making callers to verify who requested the wire, who authorized it, use a phone number that's already on file. Try not to take anything that someone's recently given to you. There's so many common things about somehow these CADO and phishing happens. They're gonna urge you to do something immediately. Don't talk to me for some reason. Well, in the case of losing a substantial amount of money, sometimes it's better to slow it down, have it be inconvenient than to risk the loss. And then lastly, investigate the IP addresses. Most modern banking systems, whether it's wires, bill pay, or ACH, is really going to be tracking the IP addresses for the source of who logged in, who started it, who requested it. Yes?
What if they're working through a VPN, so they switch the IP address?
VPN, well, that's an interesting thing. In 2010, there was a directive from FFIEC, which governs all the banking electronic, where really we're supposed to be putting things in place so we can actually identify, no matter how many layers we went through, whose keyboard actually started it. Some systems have gone there, some have not, because the expense of fairly elaborate programming, but that is the one way. A VPN is where you could VPN to China and then go into Mexico and then come into Alabama and then come to Iowa. And there's actually software you can do that helps you do that on purpose so that you are anonymous.
Yeah.
A very good question. It can be difficult, and that's one of those things where if you talk to the bank about what they can and cannot do, maybe they can get inside the packets and actually find the source, maybe they cannot.
Right.
Very good question.
And so, one of the points that Bob's made about evolving threats is that, threats are constantly evolving. The technical abilities of fraudsters are always evolving. And so the point I always make when working with clients on cybersecurity is that you need to have a layer of security that's not technical, that's process and control oriented. And it was a point that Bob made a little bit earlier too. In this circumstance, we had a couple of breakdowns in the process where the controller was apparently the only one who could set up or could by herself set up a wire transfer. And so having more than one person involved in that would have been an effective control. And then, of course, as Bob mentioned several times, calling the quote-unquote lawyer back was a mistake. I have a case in here involving State Bank of Bellingham. I'm going to skip it a little bit because I want to get to the section talking about ransomware and how to respond to a ransom attack, because I don't want to infringe on anyone's afternoon here any more than we already have. Ransomware attack is probably one of the highest priority threats that organizations are facing right now because it's so crippling to the organization, and once ransomware is installed on your system, you don't have a lot of options. And so the situations that I've seen are really difficult for organizations to respond to. Just imagine going back to the office this afternoon, logging into your computer to catch up on email after being out for a day, and everything's encrypted. What do you do? Well, Bob talked about this a little bit earlier. Hopefully your organization has some kind of offline backup, a backup that has not been connected to your primary system in such a way that the malware is getting backed up onto your backup. Because I've seen that happen, where a client has had a disaster backup, something off-site that's an effective mitigation against a flood, a tornado, whatever, power failure, but the malware ends up getting live updated onto that backup, and it encrypts the backup as well. If you don't have a backup, you're probably going to be talking to your attorney as well as a forensic investigator in order to try to mitigate the risk that comes from that ransomware incident. The forensic team can help you ensure that you fenced off that system if possible. Depending upon how quickly you move and how much access the forensic team has. If you have insurance or you don't have insurance and you don't have a backup, you may be tempted to pay the ransom. It's a difficult decision that an organization has to make. There is insurance available now that will pay ransoms, and they will connect you with attorneys and negotiators that will help you negotiate the ransom with the fraudsters. The FBI is counseled against paying the ransom, but if you've got insurance that'll pay, many organizations make the decision to go ahead and have that and pay that ransom. Even if you don't have insurance, you may want to pay because you compare the cost of reconstructing all of the data that you have lost to encryption and compare that to the cost of what the ransom is being demanded. But then, of course, there are practical difficulties. Most of the time they want to be paid in Bitcoin, and so you have to go out and be able to collect the Bitcoin. There are trusted vendors that can help with that. The FBI can occasionally put you in touch with some of those people, or knowledgeable professionals who've worked in this area can do so. One of the interesting questions that comes up when we're dealing with ransomware is whether or not organizations have an obligation to pay if the cost of doing so is substantially less than the cost to the organization of rebuilding all of the data. I don't think a court would ever hold an organization liable for not paying because there's probably a public policy against paying ransoms. But on the other hand, if your organization ceases to function as a result of not paying the ransom, you may have to weigh that in making that decision. The City of Atlanta is a good example of what can happen if you don't pay. City of Atlanta had everything encrypted. Hackers demanded $50,000. They decided not to pay. Cost the city $17 million in remediation expense. And they were down for the better part of 3 months. People couldn't pay their parking tickets. Municipal services were down. People couldn't pay their water bills except in cash, showing up to the city council. That's an option for a government because consumers don't really have another choice of where to go. That may not be a choice for a private business with customers. I want to talk about insurance because I see a lot of litigation over whether or not organizations have insurance for cybersecurity events. Originally, everybody had computer fraud coverage. Computer fraud coverage covered unauthorized access to your system, hacking. And that was it from the insurance company's perspective. There were a lot of cases like the PSG case where PSG had computer fraud coverage and they had a social engineering loss and the carrier said, no, we're not going to pay. Because that is a different kind of loss than what's covered under the scope of our policy. And it was mixed results. Yes, question?
In that particular case, how come errors and omissions wouldn't take care of that? I mean, the employee had an error and ultimately when the coverage covered for that?
Yeah, it depends. I don't know what other insurance PSG had. I assume that if they had any other coverage available to them, they would have made a claim under that, and that would have been litigated as part of that. But my suspicion is that the errors and omissions carves out any kind of fraud loss from an organization like this. But I don't know what their insurance situation was. Yes.
I work in insurance. I can kind of answer that question. It's pretty much excluded on a typical E&O policy. So
Yeah.
it's not really what the E&O is meant to pay for. So you have to have a completely separate cyber policy to
Right.
pay for anything like that because it'll be excluded on your general liability and every other
Yep.
policy.
Yeah, definitely what I've seen, and you can probably speak to this as well, is that the carriers are pushing this risk out of any other policy into standalone policies. And most of the time when I'm working with an organization looking at their insurance coverage options, they'll have computer fraud, they'll have some kind of event or incident management policy which covers notifying your customers that their confidential information has been compromised, and they may have kidnapping, extortion, ransom coverage. They often do not have social engineering coverage, which covers the loss like you saw in PSG. And some of the coverage that I've seen has high deductibles for social engineering and low limits, which tells you that the carriers think, yeah, we'll insure you, but it's a pretty common type of loss, and so we're not willing to just write a blank check to you for that kind of loss. So when you're looking at your insurance that you have available, you need to make sure that you're looking at all the different kinds of potential losses that you may suffer. And it's not enough to just tell your broker, I want cyber, because cyber typically, from what I've seen, only means event management, incident response types of coverage. It doesn't necessarily include the social engineering, computer fraud, or the ransomware. And then, of course, there's a lot of different issues within your insurance coverage. You want to try to make sure you have coverage for both first and third-party loss. So if you have a contractual obligation to anybody that requires you to reimburse them for costs they incur as a result of your breach, so I can think of like if you work with healthcare companies, if you are considered a business associate under HIPAA, you may have obligations to indemnify the covered entity in the event that a compromise at your organization causes them to incur loss. The same is true if you're a retailer and you have point of sale systems at your business. You may have a contractual obligation to reimburse banks, the payment card networks, in the event of a breach at your location. Think of Target, Home Depot, any of those payment card breaches. That won't be third-party loss. That loss that you have to pay somebody else for may not be covered under the policy that you have that only covers your loss. So it's important, and some pretty big national companies have been burned by that. So it's important that you look holistically at the insurance you have. If you don't, then you're going to be talking to somebody like me who's going to be trying to litigate whether or not the coverage that you have stated in your policy actually covers the event that you experienced. So covered a lot of material. I know I will be happy to stick around and answer questions. I'm sure Bob will too. Our contact information's there. Feel free to reach out to either one of us. We'll be happy to talk offline or some other time.